My name is Zoe Blackwood, 26 years old, and I teach in the small town of Ravencrest, nestled between towering mountains and dense forests. A town where local folklore is as much a part of everyday life as breakfast. It all started on a Friday afternoon after classes. The air was thick with the scent of impending rain, and a thin mist began to form in the streets. I was putting away my books when Lily, one of my brightest students, approached my desk. "Miss Blackwood," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "have you ever heard of the fairies of Black Lake?" I smiled, thinking it was just another local legend. "Of course, Lily. It's an old story, isn't it?" Her eyes widened, a mixture of fear and excitement gleaming in them. "It's not just a story, miss. They're real, and tonight is when they appear." Something in the intensity of her gaze made me hesitate. "Lily, you know those are just legends, right?" She shook her head vigorously. "No, they're not. My friends and I, we saw them. They're beautiful and terrible." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You should go see for yourself, at midnight at Black Lake, but be careful, they call for you." Before I could ask more, Lily ran out of the room, leaving only the echo of her footsteps and a chill down my spine. I should have let it go. I should have gone home, prepared my lesson for Monday and forgotten all about fairies and haunted lakes. But something inside me, that insatiable curiosity that made me fall in love with literature in the first place, wouldn't let me rest. That night, as the full moon hung ominously in the sky, I found myself driving deep into the forest, toward Black Lake. The path to Black Lake was a narrow, winding trail that snaked through the dense forest. As I left the comforting lights of the town behind, the darkness seemed to swallow my little car, the trees closing in around me like silent sentinels. The mist that had started to form earlier was now a tangible presence, rolling in ghostly waves across the forest floor. My headlights barely penetrated the thick fog, and every turn in the road carried the threat of the unknown. Finally, I reached a small clearing where the road ended abruptly. Black Lake lay beyond, hidden by the mist and thick vegetation. I turned off the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. The only sound was the frantic beating of my own heart. I stepped out of the car, the damp grass crunching under my feet. The air was heavy, laden with a smell I couldn't quite place, metallic, almost like blood, but mixed with something sweet and rotten. As I neared the lake's edge, every step seemed harder than the last. It was like walking through molasses, my movements slow and heavy. The mist coiled around me, cold and damp against my skin, and I had the unsettling feeling that I was being watched. Suddenly, I heard a whisper, so faint it could have been just the wind in the leaves. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Zoe," I froze. The voice came from no specific direction. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the forest itself was calling to me. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling more than I'd like to admit. Silence was the only reply. But when I turned to head back to the car, I realized with horror that I could no longer see it. The mist had thickened so much I could barely see my own hand in front of my face. I was completely lost, alone in the dark, with only the soft sound of water and that persistent whisper for company. "Zoe, come see." Against all logic and survival instinct, I found myself moving toward the voice, toward the lake. The black water shimmered under the moonlight, a perfect mirror reflecting the starry sky above. And then, I saw them. The lights began as tiny, bright points on the surface of the lake, no bigger than fireflies. But as they drew closer, they grew in size and intensity. My heart raced. Could these really be fairies? Were they the magical, enchanting creatures from the stories I had always loved? But when the lights came close enough for me to make out their shapes, all thoughts of magic and enchantment evaporated, replaced by a primordial terror that froze my blood in my veins. These creatures were a perversion of everything fairies were supposed to be. Their bodies were thin and elongated, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Their skin was a sickly white, almost translucent, allowing me to see dark veins pulsing beneath. But it was their faces that truly horrified me. Huge, black eyes like bottomless pits dominated their faces, with no visible iris or pupil. Flattened noses twitched like animals sniffing the air, and their mouths were grotesque slashes filled with needle-like teeth arranged in uneven rows. They danced over the water in a hypnotic choreography, their movements fluid and inhuman. With each spin, their eyes locked onto mine, and I felt as if they were staring straight into my soul. The metallic smell I had noticed earlier intensified, and with horror, I realized its source. Dark stains marked the teeth and claw-like hands of the creatures. Blood, it was blood, stomach churned, and I doubled over, vomiting violently onto the grass by my feet. But even as my body recoiled in disgust, a treacherous part of my mind was drawn to their macabre dance. "Zoe?" The voice came again, now clearly coming from the lake. It wasn't a gentle request, but an imperious command that resonated through my being. Against my will, I felt my feet moving toward the water. The fairies, if I could still call them that, seemed to smile, their teeth gleaming in the moonlight. It was then that I felt something cold touch my leg. I screamed, jumping back, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the lake, I saw my own reflection in the dark water, but it wasn't me. Or rather, it was a distorted, horrifying version of myself. My eyes in the reflection were black and empty, my mouth filled with sharp teeth. And as I watched, horrified, my reflection began to be pulled into the depths of the lake, as if some invisible force was dragging me down. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed, trapped by the hypnotic gaze of the creatures now edging closer to the shore. And then they began to sing. The melody that came from the fairies was unlike anything I had ever heard. It wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense. It was a cacophony of discordant notes and impossible rhythms. Yet there was a hypnotic quality to it, like a primal call that resonated deep within my soul. The words were in a language I had never heard before, guttural syllables and hissing sounds that no human throat should be able to produce. Yet somehow, I understood. Not with my mind, but with every fiber of my being. It was a call, an invitation, a promise. Images began to float before my eyes. Myself, transformed into one of those creatures, free from the limitations of mortality, dancing eternally beneath the waters of Black Lake. Part of me screamed in horror, but another part, one I hadn't known existed, longed for it. My feet began to move on their own, dragging me closer to the water. I could feel the cold creeping up my ankles, my shins, my knees. The water was thick, almost viscous, and I had the terrible sensation that I was being swallowed alive. Then one of the fairies leapt from the water. Its movements were swift and fluid, like a predator attacking its prey. Its claw-like hands closed around my wrist, and I felt a sharp pain as its nails pierced my skin. With supernatural strength, the creature pulled me into the lake. The freezing water enveloped me, stealing my breath and silencing my screams. As I sank, the fairy's song grew louder, reverberating through the water and through my very body. As I descended deeper, I began to see shapes in the darkness below. At first, I thought they were rocks or aquatic plants, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, the horrifying truth revealed itself. Bodies. Dozens, maybe hundreds of bodies floating in the depths of the lake. Some were recent, their expressions of terror still visible on their pale faces. Others were nothing but skeletons, stripped of flesh by the passage of time and the lake's inhabitants. And then, with a jolt of recognition that sent a wave of terror through my already frozen body, I saw familiar faces. My students, my colleagues, my friends. Lily was there, her once bright eyes now empty and lifeless. Beside her, I recognized other faces from my class. All of them, drawn into this watery nightmare by the same call I had followed. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They hadn't been warning me about the fairies. They had been luring me to join them. As the darkness began to close in around me and my lungs screamed for air, one final thought crossed my mind. I wouldn't be the last. The fairies would continue calling and others would come. The cycle would continue, fueled by human curiosity and the irresistible call of the unknown. My consciousness began to fade, and I felt my body starting to change. My fingers lengthened into claws, my teeth sharpened into fangs. The darkness was no longer frightening, it was a welcoming embrace. And so, Zoe Blackwood, the literature teacher, died. And something new, something ancient and terrible, was born in the depths of Black Lake. The song continued, echoing through the dark waters, calling the next curious soul, the next fool, to join the eternal chorus of the Black Lake fairies. Weeks passed. In the small town of Ravencrest, missing posters with Zoe Blackwood's face began to fade under the sun and rain. The searches were called off, theories multiplied, but no one ever uncovered the truth about what had happened to the young literature teacher. At the school, a new teacher now stood in Zoe's classroom. The students whispered among themselves, exchanging knowing glances. Some of them had already heard the call, had already seen the lights dancing over Black Lake. And at night, when the moon was full and the mist rolled through the streets, if you listened closely enough, you might hear a voice in the wind. A voice that sounded almost, but not quite, like Zoe Blackwood's. "Come see, come join us." The cycle continued. The Black Lake fairies waited, patient and eternal, for their next victim. The envelope arrived on a rainy Tuesday with no return address, just my name scribbled in shaky handwriting. Marcus Alves, 32 years old, historian. As I opened it, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves flooded my office. The letter inside was brief, the words seemingly written in haste. "The fairy of Mirkwood Forest is not what she seems. Elowen is waiting. Do not go to her. Please burn this letter." I laughed, thinking it was a tasteless joke, but something about the desperate tone of the words made my stomach churn. As a historian specializing in mythology and folklore, I had heard stories about Elowen, a guardian fairy who, after being betrayed by human greed, had turned into a vengeful spirit. I tried to ignore it, tossing the letter into a drawer, but at night, in my dreams, I heard whispers coming from the forest. An ethereal voice softly called my name, beckoning me into the depths of Mirkwood. I woke up in a cold sweat, the blankets twisted around me like a shroud. Curiosity had already sunk its claws into me. I knew I wouldn't find peace until I investigated. The next morning, I set off for Mirkwood. The sky was heavy with dark clouds, ready to burst. I parked my car at the edge of the road and stared at the green wall in front of me. The trees were ancient, their twisted trunks seemingly telling stories from forgotten eras. As I took the first step into the forest, it felt like I had crossed an invisible veil. The air grew thick, weighing heavily in my lungs. The tree canopies formed such a dense ceiling that barely any sky could be seen. The faint light that did filter through had a sickly, greenish hue. I walked for hours, the sensation of being watched growing with each step. The branches seemed to writhe, forming grotesque figures that disappeared when I looked directly at them. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional snap of twigs beneath my feet. As I ventured deeper, I noticed strange markings on the tree trunks. Ancient symbols. Some I recognized from my studies of Celtic peoples, while others were entirely alien, making my eyes ache as I tried to decipher them. The day darkened, but I barely noticed the passage of time. I was entranced by the forest, following a path that seemed to unfold before me. That's when I heard it for the first time, the song. It was a soft melody, almost imperceptible. Sweet and melancholic, it tightened my heart with a longing I didn't know I had. Without realizing it, my pace quickened toward that ethereal voice. Before I knew it, I had stumbled into a clearing. The air here was different, heavy with a sweet scent that made my head spin. In the center stood a small wooden cabin, its rotting planks covered in a carpet of glistening moss. I approached cautiously. The singing had stopped, leaving behind a disturbing silence. The cabin door was ajar, creaking gently in the breeze. I hesitated for a moment, a voice deep in my mind screaming for me to run. I ignored the warning. I pushed the door open. The stench of decay hit me like a punch, turning my stomach. But it was the sight inside that froze me in place. Hanging from the low ceiling, swaying gently, were dozens of human bones. Skulls, ribs, femurs, all strung together by invisible threads forming a macabre dance above my head. On the packed dirt floor, a circle of dried blood. The runes along its edge were ancient. Some I recognized from forbidden texts I had studied in secret, others completely unknown, their lines writhing before my eyes as if alive. That's when I realized I was no longer alone. The door slammed shut behind me with a crash, throwing me into the circle. A cold laugh echoed through the cabin, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Marcus," the voice whispered, so close I could feel its icy breath on the back of my neck. "You shouldn't have come." I spun around abruptly, but there was no one there, just the gentle sway of the bones on the ceiling, as if they were mocking my naivety. "Elowen?" My voice trembled, barely a whisper. "Is it you?" The answer came in the form of a cold wind that swept through the cabin, snuffing out the faint light that had been filtering through the cracks. I was plunged into complete darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt something brush against my arms. Cold, delicate fingers trailing across my skin. I tried to pull away, but I was frozen, held to the ground by an invisible force. "You came looking for me, Marcus." Elowen's voice was both sweet and menacing. "Now you will learn the truth you sought." A sharp pain exploded in my chest. I looked down, and even in the darkness, I could see something moving beneath my skin. Something was growing inside me, trying to break free. I screamed, but the sound was muffled by an unseen hand. The smell of rotting flowers intensified, making my head spin. "Shh," Elowen whispered. "Don't fight. Soon, you'll be part of something greater. Part of me." The pain grew unbearable. I felt my skin stretching, tearing. From within my body, branches sprouted, leaves, flowers of a morbid beauty. I was becoming a living tree, conscious, trapped forever in that cursed cabin. My mind began to splinter. I saw flashes of other lives, other people Elowen had lured into her web. There were many of us, all part of her eternal collection. My last coherent thought was a silent prayer, hoping that someone would one day find my writings, hidden in the forest. A warning for the next fools who ventured into Mirkwood. Then the darkness consumed me completely, and I became one with Elowen's forest. Years have passed. The cabin in the clearing still stands, waiting for its next victim. The bones on the ceiling have gained a new companion. A twisted tree, with blood-red flowers, grows in the center of the rune circle. And if you listen closely, you might hear a whisper coming from its leaves. A voice that once belonged to a historian named Marcus, now part of Elowen's eternal symphony. The forest fairy waits, patient. After all, there will always be more curious souls, more fools, more lives to add to her collection. The monotonous hum of the camera was my constant companion during those days. I, Stella, 24 years old, a film student, was headfirst into my graduation project, a documentary about fairy tales. I spent weeks interviewing folklorists, exploring dusty libraries, and scouring the internet for forgotten tales. It was on one of those endless research nights that I received the message. My phone vibrated, illuminating the darkness of my room with a ghostly glow. The name on the screen was unfamiliar. Madeline. "Hello, Stella. I heard about your documentary. I know a place where fairies still live. Interested?" My heart raced. This could be the missing piece, the touch of magic that would elevate my documentary from mediocre to extraordinary. With trembling fingers I replied, "Very interested. Can we talk more about it?" The response came almost instantly. "Of course. But not through text. Some stories need to be told in person. Meet me tomorrow at Café Twilight at 3 p.m. I slept poorly that night, my dreams filled with winged beings with smiles too sharp to be benign. The next morning, I shared the news with Juan, my boyfriend, and our group of friends. Lucia, the aspiring writer with a penchant for the occult, Miguel, the skeptical biology student, and Camila, the sensitive artist who swore she'd seen a goblin as a child. "Guys, this could be huge," I said, excitement bubbling in my voice. "If it's true, we could make history." John looked at me with a mix of concern and affection. "Stella, love, are you sure? It seems risky." I laughed, brushing aside his worries with a wave of my hand. "Come on, Joelle, where's your sense of adventure? Besides, we'll all be together. What could go wrong?" Oh, how I would regret those words. Café Twilight was a peculiar place, hidden down a narrow alley in the old part of town. The foggy windows barely let in daylight, and the interior was lit by flickering candles that cast dancing shadows on the bare stone walls. Madeline was already there when I arrived, seated in a secluded corner. She stood out against the cafe's somber atmosphere. Her skin was almost translucent, her eyes large and luminous. Her smile when she saw me seemed to stretch in a way that defied human anatomy. "Stella," she said, her voice a strange melody that sent shivers down my spine. "I'm glad you came." I sat across from her, trying to ignore the sensation that something was fundamentally wrong with this woman. "So, Madeline, you mentioned knowing a place where fairies still live?" She tilted her head, her eyes never blinking. "Oh yes, an ancient place forgotten by time, a forest where magic still pulses in the veins of the trees." As Madeline spoke, I felt my reason battling against a growing desire to believe every word. She described an ancient forest just a few miles from the city, where mysterious lights danced among the trees at night, and strange melodies echoed in the air. "I can take you there," she offered, her long, pale fingers lightly brushing my hand on the table. The contact was cold, sending a shiver down my spine. "Tomorrow night. The moon will be full, perfect for seeing the fairies." Something inside me screamed to refuse, to flee from this woman and her fantastic promises. But the opportunity was too great to let slip away. "We'll be there," I heard my voice say, seemingly of its own accord. Madeline's smile widened even more, revealing teeth too sharp to be comfortable. "Excellent," she purred. "I can't wait to show you the hidden wonders of the forest." As I left the cafe, the sun seemed to have lost a bit of its shine. The excitement for the adventure ahead mixed with an undefinable dread that settled deep in my stomach. That night, as we prepared the equipment for filming, I tried to ignore the worried glances John shot my way. "It'll be fine," I repeated to myself, a mantra that sounded emptier with each repetition. If I had known what awaited us in the forest, I would have burned the cameras and run as far away as possible. But ignorance is a cruel blessing, and we were cheerfully walking into our doom. The twilight painted the sky in bloody hues when we reached the edge of the forest. Madeline was waiting for us, an ethereal figure against the dark backdrop of the trees. Her smile seemed even wider, more ravenous. "Welcome," she whispered, her voice carrying a strange echo, fading into the depths of the forest. "Magic awaits us." I exchanged nervous glances with my friends. Yuan squeezed my hand, a comforting gesture that did little to dissipate the chill settling in my chest. In the first steps into the forest, everything seemed normal. Tall, ancient trees surrounded us, their branches forming a natural cathedral overhead. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves filled the air. But as we moved forward, following Madeline along a path that only she seemed to see, things began to change. The air thickened, laden with a fine mist that seemed to glow with its own light. The sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the song of night birds, gradually gave way to an oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of our footsteps and something else. A constant whisper, almost imperceptible, seemed to come from all directions. "Are you guys hearing this?" Lucia asked, her voice trembling slightly. Miguel, our skeptic, tried to rationalize it. "It's probably just the wind in the leaves, nothing to worry about." But it wasn't the wind, it was something else. Something that twisted my stomach with primordial fear. Camila, always the most sensitive of our group, suddenly stopped. "Guys, something feels off here. Very off. I think we should turn back." Madeline turned to us, her eyes shining in the encroaching darkness. "Oh, but we're so close now. Don't you want to see the fairies?" Her voice had a hypnotic quality, and I felt my urge to retreat dissolve. "Yes," I heard myself say. "We want to see the fairies." We kept walking, the forest growing denser and darker around us. The trees seemed to contort, their branches forming grotesque shapes that vanished when we looked directly at them. That's when we saw the first light, a small blue orb floating among the trees. It seemed to beckon us, dancing in the air like a magical soap bubble. "There!" I shouted, pointing. "Do you see it?" More lights began to appear, red, green, gold. They danced around us, guiding us deeper into the forest. "They're here," Madeline whispered, her voice heavy with a sinister reverence. "The fairies are calling us." Hypnotized by the lights, we hardly noticed we had reached a clearing. In the center, ancient stones formed a perfect circle. And in the middle of that circle— "My God," John murmured, his voice cracking with terror. A faint light emanated from the ground, pulsing like a sick heart. And around this light, shadows moved. Half human, half something else. Creatures that should not exist in our world. They weren't fairies, they were nightmares made real. John's scream tore through the silence of the night when one of the shadows touched him. It was as if all life was being sucked from his body. His skin wrinkled, his eyes sunk into their sockets, and in a matter of seconds, my boyfriend, the man I loved, transformed into a desiccated husk of what he once was. "John!" I screamed, trying to run to him. But my feet were rooted to the ground, roots bursting from the earth and wrapping around my legs. Around me, chaos erupted. Miguel the skeptic was screaming hysterically as his body dissolved into dark mist. Lucia was trying to recite some sort of protective prayer, but her words were swallowed by a scream of agony as one of the creatures pierced her chest. Camila. Poor Camila. She simply vanished, as if she had never existed. And Madeline. Oh, Madeline. She was in the center of the stone circle, her arms raised to the sky, her body twisting in an impossible way. Her skin tore, revealing not flesh and bone, but a pulsing mass of shadows and light. "Welcome to the true realm of the fairies," she cackled, her voice now a cacophony of 1,000 screams of pain. "You wanted magic? Here it is, in all its terrible glory." The shadows danced around us, touching, tearing, consuming. Every touch felt like ice and fire at once, ripping away not just our lives but our very essence. I wanted to scream, wanted to cry, wanted to run. But I was paralyzed, forced to watch as my friends, the people I loved most in the world, were torn apart before my eyes. And then, just when I thought the horror couldn't get any worse, the shadows turned toward me. The touch of the shadows felt like 1,000 ice needles piercing my soul. I felt my consciousness fragment, memories of an entire life flashing before my eyes in a confusing whirlwind. I saw my childhood, dreams of becoming a great filmmaker, my first kiss with Huao, late nights of studying with friends. Each memory was ripped from me, consumed by the hungry shadows. But something within me resisted. Perhaps it was my desire to tell this story, to warn others about the horror we had encountered. Or maybe it was simply the instinct to survive, screaming against the darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. In a final act of desperation, I grasped the camera still hanging around my neck. With trembling fingers, I managed to press the record button. "If anyone finds this," I whispered, my voice almost unrecognizable, "stay away from the forest. The fairies. They aren't what we think. They are." My voice faltered as a searing pain coursed through my body. I looked down and, horrified, saw that my skin was becoming translucent. I could see my organs pulsing, dissolving, transforming into something different. The last thing I saw was Madeline's face, or what had once been Madeline. Her smile was too wide, filled with sharp teeth and infinite hunger. "Welcome to eternity, Stella," she whispered. And then darkness engulfed me. I don't know how much time has passed, days, years, centuries. Time holds no meaning here, in this realm between worlds. I am a shadow now, a memory of what I once was. Part of me still exists trapped in this cursed forest. I watch, powerless, as Madeline, or the thing that wears her form, lures more victims into our circle of stones. Young explorers, couples seeking a romantic spot, families on excursions. They've all come, drawn by the promise of magic and mystery. And they all join us, feeding the insatiable hunger of the true fairies. Sometimes when the moon is full and the barrier between worlds is thinner, I can manifest for a brief moment. I try to warn them, try to scream for them to run. But my voice is merely a whisper in the wind, easily mistaken for the rustling of leaves. And so the cycle continues. The forest waits, patient and hungry. The shadows dance, ready to welcome new companions into their eternal embrace. As for me, I wait. I hope that one day someone will be strong enough to resist, to break the spell, or that someone will find my camera, lost somewhere,